I'm not gonna beat around the bush here and start off this video with my overall conclusion on the Outer Worlds. It's fine. Certainly not bad, but also not really great. That's the long and short of it. But there are many nuances here that explain why I come away from this game less than ecstatic. I guess my first instinct was to compare it to Fallout New Vegas. After all, it's generally very reminiscent of the overall structure and formula of that game, and it was also made by the same studio. Even though I'm aware that many of the key people responsible for making Fallout New Vegas seemingly had little to do with the Outer Worlds, that connection alone still colors some of my perception of it. I mean, they have the talent right there to make a good or even great RPG, so it seems weird to not use them. Besides, the Fallout comparison isn't too far-fetched even beyond that, given that both the project leads Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky worked on the original Fallout games. And some of that Fallout energy can certainly be felt in the Outer Worlds. But I guess this is just a long-winded way of me justifying my comparisons between the Outer Worlds and Fallout New Vegas. If you feel that's inappropriate, ignore these comparisons whenever they come up. What I really like about the Outer Worlds is its main theme. Or at least what I personally perceive as the main theme. As soon as you step foot into the game's universe, you're greeted by Halcyon, a colony of planets around a distant star that has wholeheartedly embraced capitalism in its most extreme form. Entire towns are built, owned and governed by corporations, where their deeply subservient employees slave away in their factories in the hopes of ever achieving the dream of living in Byzantium, the rich capital of the colony. Obviously, the game is rigged against them, just like in real life, but the population is either ignorant of that or knows it and doesn't care, since in their mind, once they'll make it, they're the ones benefiting from a rigged system. Again, like in real life. The central theme in the Outer Worlds is brutally obvious. There's absolutely no subtlety about it. Capitalism sucks. If you're the beneficiary of it, you either are or turn into a heartless bastard who's comfortable with subjecting others to a terrible existence for your own comfort. And if you're a cog in the machine, you'll get to live a life devoid of meaning beyond hitting quotas. And the icing on the cake is that most of the population revels in this state of affairs. Oh sure, there are dissidents among the populace who seek to live on their own, free from the reign of Byzantium and its elites, but they're always the underdogs when you reach them. There's no fair competition here for outsiders. There might be multiple corporations running Halcyon jointly as the so-called board, but there's no seat at the table for people who the board doesn't want to play with, as evidenced by Monarch Stellar Industries, who were once ousted from the board and their entire planet was declared off-limits to the people of the colony. I started to wonder at some point why exactly the game is so overt in its critique of capitalism. I even contemplated on asking the creative leads themselves about it in an idealistic and naive moment where I thought either Tim Kaine or Leonard Boyarsky would feel like answering questions from some random nobody about a game they released almost half a decade ago. I started to do some research and stumbled upon this interview with Boyarsky where he mentioned that the game is less of a critique of modern capitalism and more about power and how power is used against people who don't have it. Huh. This sentiment really didn't sit well with me. For one, it's such an unspecific aspiration. Almost every game about adversity is about power. That's where adversity comes from, someone exerting power over someone else. To me, there are only two explanations for that quote. The first one, the one I don't actually believe to be true, is that Boyarsky has abso-fucking-lutely no clue what kind of story he wrote. You can't accidentally write a scathing critique of capitalism, and trust me, there's some brutal stuff in the Outer Worlds, and then turn around and seriously say, well, capitalism ain't that bad and we really didn't want to critique it with our game. No, to me this sounds like the trite-old Ubisoft defense they wheel out whenever they make overtly politically charged games like The Division or Watch Dogs. Games that love to include stories about specific ideologies and references to real-world events and then feebly pretend in marketing materials and interviews that their games aren't intended to be political. It's a way to cover your ass, so you don't have to admit that yes, capitalism fucking sucks, because a certain part of the gaming demographic will immediately boycott your creation and label you a commie. Or they're the type of people who will complain about creatives quote-unquote shoving politics into their media and down their throats. You know the type. The people who can watch fucking Star Wars, a trilogy of films about a fascist empire explicitly styled after the motherfucking Nazis, who hunt for a bunch of hippies trying to bring down said empire, and pretend that nothing about these films is political. Or that The Lord of the Rings was also completely apolitical, even though it's a bunch of bickering and warring kingdoms and, you know, literal racism, and half the interactions of the Fellowship is mired in diplomacy. Because those are the type of mouth breathers creatives have to placate to get their creations out there, so it doesn't hurt the bottom line. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, I don't believe Boyarsky for a single second that he meant this statement sincerely. The Outer Worlds is relentlessly critical of capitalism, and it's a joy to behold. The writing absolutely shines when it gets to take gorgeously worded and precisely aimed humorous jabs at what in every other situation would be hauntingly dark situations. The juxtaposition of jaunty humor delivered in a tone befitting a 50s era infomercial about things that depressed the hell out of me absolutely makes this game worth experiencing, especially since it manages to still keep it light enough to not kill the swashbuckling adventurous feel of the gameplay. It also helps that the visuals of the game, as well as the soundtrack, manage to set the game apart nicely. While the Outer Worlds, like Fallout, is focused on a retro-futuristic look, the very colorful landscapes and gorgeously designed corporate aesthetics make these worlds a sight to behold. It's just a damn shame that you sometimes can't do that in darker areas or at night, because somehow Obsidian forgot to give players a flashlight. Yeah, seems like a pretty big oversight. Still, as much as I praise the game for its strong core theme and refreshing relentless bluntness of its delivery, The Outer Worlds seems to be very attached to typical RPG conventions. You have your main quest, a lot of side quests, skills to level, perks to choose, and a lot of combat and many conversations to engage in. That puts it right back in the same territory occupied by Fallout New Vegas and a plethora of other RPGs. And I feel that this adherence to convention hinders The Outer Worlds from being a truly great game. Let's take the first two things on that list as an example, the main quest and the side quests. Even just the fact that we're making specific distinctions here seems silly if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Now I understand why this is. Games segment off their main quests and side quests so players don't inadvertently continue with the main plot while there's still other stuff to do. Having categories in the quest log is comfortable for players to do all the little side activities the current chunk of game has to offer before continuing with the main narrative. It also makes it easier for developers to compartmentalize the stories they intend to tell and form smaller narrative arcs within the game. That approach generally makes sense at first glance, but it only makes sense insofar as we agree that side quests should generally be completely unrelated to the main quest. And I disagree with that notion, because it tends to lead to games where the main quest doesn't get treated as a means of telling a compelling story. The main quest becomes a glorified tour guide, a reason for you to visit the places where the side quests happen and to talk to the NPCs giving you those quests. That often also means that the main quests and side quests rarely interact. Typically there's a payoff of some form at the very end if you do all the side quests or see certain storylines to their conclusion, and the Outer Worlds also has that, but that's about it. And the main narrative consequently also never really has anything to do with these side quests and vice versa. They don't materially influence each other and oftentimes tell completely unrelated stories, unless the main quest just stops and basically tells you, look, head out into the world and do some chores, the big villain can wait. Speaking of which, even though the game has a strong foundation with its core theme to build a compelling narrative upon, to me it really seems like there was little focus on making the most of that with the main narrative. As is typical for RPGs, there's a bunch of factions in the game. But I always feel like the designers didn't try whenever I play RPGs that allow you to basically do all the quests for every faction in the game. To me, it would make the worlds more believable if aligning yourself with a certain faction automatically means that you simply cannot interact with another one that somehow opposes the first one. But a lot of modern games have started giving you the option of just doing everything simultaneously. Heck, this game gives you the option of just siding with the board while still doing all the quests from the other perspective. The only reason I didn't do any of the board's quests on my initial playthrough was because I was actually role-playing and doing it out of principle. Nothing in the game hindered me from joining what were obviously the villains of the piece. And honestly, the main narrative doesn't do much for me either. It's overall fairly low-key. And sure, while the stakes ramp up eventually when certain revelations come to light about the state of the colony, though you'd have to be severely oblivious to not notice that coming from a mile away, it still remains a weirdly small-scale affair. Obsidian did try to recreate the Battle of Hoover Dam scenario from Fallout New Vegas with its final chapter, in the sense that it's a long combat gauntlet through enemy territory, and the factions you've helped along the way help you by clearing out the enemies on your way to the final confrontation. But to me, this came entirely out of left field. I didn't anticipate it in any way, because I had no conversation with any of these factions after I did their quests and then forgot about them for like 30 hours, because again, all the side quests, while thematic offshoots from the core theme, don't interact with the main narrative. Maybe part of the problem was that I played the Spacer's Choice version, which includes the 2 expansion packs. Their suggested levels can be reached at around the time before you embark on the final stretch of the main narrative. And since you can't go back later to complete them, you're basically stuck doing a detour for a couple of hours. Not a bad detour, mind you. I generally really enjoyed both the expansions. Perils on Gorgon nicely explains parts of the setting in interesting and thematically appropriate ways. It's just a shame that it didn't have much to offer on the combat side. Especially since it touts the character Charles from accounting as this intimidating enemy, but when I encountered him, he was just a regular Joe that went down in a couple of hits. Murder on Eridanos was especially enjoyable for me because it's a murder mystery. That means more talking than fighting. Not much to say beyond that. Again, very fitting story for the setting and very well written at that. Still, both the expansions and the base game suffer from the fact that not everything about its quests tries to tug at the same rope. This is an aspect of gaming that has been a point of contention for me for some time now. I've come to absolutely hate how formulaic games have become in their ways of content delivery. Ubisoft, for example, have quite deservedly become a punching bag in that regard in the way they've designed their games. Open worlds with a bunch of mission markers, which often already tell you what types of missions you'll be engaging in based on their icons, which then turn into checklists of tasks to cross off on your to-do list. Thankfully, the Outer Worlds doesn't go so far. It's still up to you to talk to people and find quests yourself. You're not given a marker on your map for every quest giver, which I applaud. But behind the scenes, it still adheres to the same convention that we expect of RPGs. You get to a place because the main quest demands it, you check in with the locals, get to know their inevitable problems, maybe encounter a companion along the way to take with you, and you either solve all the problems in the region or decide to not bother with the side quests altogether if you're the type who's into games that lets you skip most of the content for some reason. And once that companion is in your party, you can be sure they've got a few quests for you too. If you've played a few RPGs in the last couple of years, this kind of formula is likely to be very familiar to you. And the fact that a veteran RPG player can spot these patterns so easily is exactly what makes me dislike them. I would have liked to see greater emphasis put on the main quest and maybe side quests structured in a way where they naturally become part of the main quest itself, rather than segmenting off the different quests with their own headings in the quest log. You know, instead of making side quests entirely optional, make them all mandatory. Block off progress until the player has dealt with everything along the way. You can still do that in creative ways that allow for freedom, and the Outer Worlds even manages to do that at certain spots, but not often enough for my taste. Even just deliberately not doing a quest still counts as quote-unquote dealing with it along the way after all. But not doing it should also have some meaningful impact on the narrative later on. I was curious to see how far into the game I could actually get with just following the main quest in the Outer Worlds. That also gave me a chance to play as the opposite of the character I created for my first run through the game. My first character, Cassandra, was my typical RPG build, someone who's intelligent, great at talking, lockpicking and sneaking, and passable at best at everything else. I did put some more points into guns later on, because I felt the stealth really wasn't that satisfying in this game. And talking your way out of trouble predicates that the life form attacking you is sentient, which not all are, so some type of offensive capability is almost necessary. My second character, Cletus, was a complete and utter moron. A strong brute who could barely breathe and walk at the same time. And because I relied on firearms for Cassandra, I decided to test out the melee combat with Cletus, given that there are multiple skill trees for melee combat. Cassandra was intent on helping everybody in the Halcyon colony. She learned whatever she could, read all the terminals she encountered, and talked to everybody. But she was obviously wary of the board running the colony, so she opted to help out all the other factions except the board. Still, not all her actions were entirely legal. She often hacked devices, picked every lock in view, and didn't hesitate to steal from everybody. Hey, you gotta fight the capitalist system of private ownership from the ground up after all. Still, she wanted to improve the state of the colony, and wherever possible sought to find amicable solutions to conflicts that reduced bloodshed. Cletus, meanwhile, only went for whatever immediate goal was right in front of him, often violently. I also wanted to make him illiterate, so he wouldn't have touched a single computer or document in the entire game. But unfortunately, you have to interact with a few terminals to actually complete the missions. To compensate, I just never read anything in front of me and just clicked on everything until the quest marked that step as completed, which I feel nicely expands upon the fact that when you play as a low intelligence character, you get special dumb dialogue choices, so not reading anything felt like the proper dumb thing to do. Cletus just didn't care at all, to the point where he took shortcuts quite frequently to get it over with. That's why he also sided exclusively with the board and immediately sold out his only ally. As I said, I wanted to mostly do main quests with Cletus, and I'm sure I could have done it if I would have just killed everybody, but that would have been a bit too limiting. Still, it was fun to go to one of the planets where you're supposed to deal with two factions and their gripes with each other and the board. Because if you're on the board side, you can just abridge the whole adventure by stomping into both settlements, killing their leaders, hightailing it out of there, and you're already done. While Cassandra dealt with their issues and pointed out how much easier it would be if they banded together, Cletus marched in and arguably made everything worse for everybody there. Choosing to do Cletus's moron run also gave me a chance to fight the final and arguably only boss if you ignore the DLC. Yeah, that's right, combat was mostly just against a variety of regular enemies, either humans in the form of opposing factions or feral marauders, a couple of robots and drones, or against the local wildlife, which consists of maybe a dozen different species with a bunch of subvariants in the entire star system. And that boss fight wasn't all that noteworthy after all. It has a very basic moveset and a ton of health, so it wasn't really a test of skill and more just about figuring out his routine. I guess what explains that is that the regular combat wasn't that engaging for either Cassandra or Cletus. Shooting feels okay, but many of the weapons aren't that satisfying to use. I got most use out of the shrink ray I got at the very start of the game, which was fun to employ. Later on, I switched over to a pistol that fired 3 bullets for every shot and shredded enemy health as a result. There's also a system by which you can upgrade weapons and armor, but it's the same old perfunctory system seen in most games where weapon modifications exist. Increase magazine size, put on a scope, and maybe change the type of ammo. It doesn't offer deep customization and to me only ever became relevant whenever I noticed that my carrying capacity was constantly at the maximum because I was carrying so many mods that I found lying around the world. I was curious how melee combat would fare and I was surprised to learn that it felt kinda good. Swinging melee weapons in first person typically feels rather underwhelming, but the swings of some of these weapons did carry some punch. It's just a shame that hitting things with a stick also means you end up running after enemies wielding firearms, so be prepared to tank a couple of shots to the face until they're within striking distance. That wouldn't necessarily be a problem if you have companions with ranged abilities, but Cletus was a loner, so I had to make do alone. This also made it important to wear proper protection. The armor system in the Outer Worlds is extremely basic though. You can carry body armor and a helmet, and that's it. It doesn't carry over the system from Fallout that allows you to wear different pieces on individual limbs. What also didn't carry over was the way you loot enemies. You can't just strip down enemies you've killed and steal their clothes or weapons, even though they're still wearing/holding them. It seems like lootable armor and weapons must exist within an enemy's inventory, not on their body. I get that making a system where you can undress every single NPC is a bit overkill, and not having a gun and some armor on every enemy's inventory declutters the game a bit, but then Obsidian should have done the same with the absolute deluge of consumables you can find on enemies, in boxes, furniture, or just lying around in the world. I get that the core theme of capitalism lends itself well to creating a variety of products those corporations sell. But I took one look at all these items and their temporary status effects and never bothered with any of it. Heck, when you level medicine, you can unlock the ability to mix additional items into your repurposed asthma inhaler that serves as a means to use medkits. But I never bothered with it because just getting back health was enough for me and the combat was already easy enough that I didn't really feel the need for any further buffs. I get that this is the point where some people might suggest turning up the difficulty, but honestly, if a game's idea of difficulty is just make the enemies tank more damage and hit harder, that to me translates into turn the game into a slog filled with bullet sponges. The combat system didn't seem to me like it gets more interesting with an increased difficulty because it's overall very basic and doesn't offer many avenues for mastery. Getting back to the looting, inventory management was a bit of a pain as well. Since this is an RPG, loot also has its own set of stats, like levels, damage dealt or absorbed, and maybe a skill bonus. When you pick up a weapon or armor from a container, you get to see all these stats, but when they're lying around on the ground, you don't, which seems like a weird inconsistency to me. Comparing weapons and armor within the inventory is also not all that graceful. You can do it, but you first have to choose the gear you wish to compare, and then hover over the other piece to compare it. I get that this offers some flexibility, but honestly I'd rather have a more rigid system that just allows comparison between whatever you have already equipped at the moment and what you're inspecting. Because in the end, that's mostly what you want to compare against to begin with. Having that on by default also saves you the step of manually engaging the comparisons every single time you wish to do so. As I typically do in RPGs, I started out looting pretty much everything because I didn't know what was worth keeping around. That also meant my carrying capacity was always hovering near the maximum, at least until I decided that I just was not going to bother with consumables that grant temporary status effects. Since I like to be tidy in these games, I like to have a chest or something in my headquarters where I can load off unwanted stuff. And your ship does have a few places to store this stuff. But the navigation in these places is not conducive to inventory management, because they're not dedicated storage spaces. They're just regular old boxes and lockers that you can find elsewhere in the world, and they're mostly just there to house a few items, not your collection of unique weapons and armor sets, along with all the shit you've picked up at the start of the game and thought you want to hang on to just in case. It seems weird to me how many games that offer inventory systems consistently get it wrong. They either forget to implement or badly implement quality of life features like these, and I can't understand why this keeps happening. Inventory management, and in a broader sense menu navigation, should be one of those things that's completely transparent to a player. Something that comes naturally and requires no thought or effort, because that should be reserved for gameplay. And yet, it seems like nobody takes this stuff seriously. But that's a tangent for another day. At some point I just relied on carrying medkits, ammo, lockpicking and hacking devices, as well as a few pieces of armor to have quick access to skill modifiers in case I needed them. Everything else was gutted into spare weapon and armor parts to be used for repairs. That eventually solved my inventory problem. But it didn't make the first couple of hours any more enjoyable in retrospect. And I still checked most of the containers and found a tremendous amount of ammo and medkits, so by the end I never really ran out. And since my funds were also steadily increasing, I had more than enough to top off my lockpicking and hacking supplies with the copious number of corporate-sponsored vending machines that you can find in Halcyon. This is actually a touch I really like about the world design, the fact that you can find a vending machine pretty much everywhere. They're even in one place where I honestly thought I wouldn't find any, and that's on the planet Monarch. As I said earlier, Monarch was purposely abandoned by the board, with only Monarch Stellar Industries and the Iconoclasts, a group of dissidents living there. Getting there requires getting a special nav key, so it's off limits to most people. But somehow, even though the member corporations of the board shun that place, they still have vending machines there for some reason. I mentioned earlier how the game also has a bunch of companions you can encounter and take on your adventures. While they're clearly all very unique types of characters, to me it seems like the two you meet on the first planet are the most fleshed out, who also get better storylines in their respective quests than the other four you can meet later on. But even then, in the long run, there's not much that made them stick to memory all that well. This is also true because they're not that useful in combat. They all have their own unique skills that you can order them to use, but I never did and at some point completely forgot I could do so. And it's a shame how little their own stories matter in the grand scheme of things, because one of them, Vicar Max, is a representative of one of the two religious groups in the colony. While the influence of both of these groups can be felt on the sidelines, this particular aspect of the colony's culture never really takes much of a prominent role in the central conflict. Max's story certainly gives a few glimpses into the workings of at least his philosophy, but it seems very insubstantial and could have benefited from a bigger presence. And speaking of the central conflict, I have to come back to the villains of the piece. Because one aspect where I feel the game has dropped the ball is with the villains and their ultimate plan. A good villain is one with whom you as the protagonist can sympathize with. If you want to present them as a valid choice to support and join, they need to be able to rationalize their philosophy and motivation to you. And ultimately, after having played both storylines, I can't really conclude that joining up with the rulers of the capitalist system made much sense, neither thematically or even just within the confines of the story itself. This is what ultimately doesn't work. The game is so highly critical of capitalism that it almost seems like a farce to play anything but the outlaw trying to tear the whole thing down. Joining forces with the board doesn't lead to a massively different story, and in general you can still opt to flip-flop the entire whale until you make that one single important choice that determines what happens at the end. Sure, in typical Fallout manner you still get an epilogue that recounts your heroic or villainous deeds, but individual actions don't have any impact on what happens. And since I didn't feel like the villain made a well thought out case for the board's plan to secure the future of the colony, which the epilogue even admits, it kinda undermines the idea of an RPG offering the freedom to choose to side with the villain. I think in the end, this is what bothers me the most about the Outer Worlds. I could sit here and keep nitpicking, talk about how the bullet time effect is not that useful and hardly justified by the plot, that perks seem like a bit of an afterthought, flaws are interesting on the surface but seem like too much of a downside for what little benefit they grant, or that leveling skills, while very granular, doesn't feel like much of a progression is taking place in the grand scheme of things. But that's all just details. The reason why I'm not more enthusiastic about the game is that I feel it doesn't do as much with its central theme as I think it could have done. I've made my stance on capitalism clear here, so the game is basically preaching to the choir. And maybe if you're a capitalism apologist, you might find stuff in here that has the potential to make you stop and think for a second before you start complaining about Stalinism or Maoism and confuse the two with socialism. But honestly, I felt the Outer Worlds doesn't do enough to justify capitalism, ironically. What I mean by that is that it doesn't do much with the idea of letting players choose the side of capitalism. Cast your mind back to Fallout New Vegas. Caesar was clearly also the villain of the piece. But so was the NCR and Mr. House. They all embodied different philosophies, and it was up to you to choose what course of action was the best for the region. There's a difference between making a game that leaves the narrative open-ended and intentionally only hands players pieces of the puzzle, and making a game that has a very noticeable bias. I'm all for using games as a parable to explore certain themes. Even though Ken Levine, by his own admission, didn't intend for BioShock to be a takedown of Randian objectivism, it still works as such. But you're never given the choice to switch sides. Rapture is a shithole as a result of the philosophy of its leaders. And I argue that the Outer Worlds should have been more like that if it wanted to keep the criticism of capitalism. By all means, make it open-ended by having factions who all offer different alternatives to capitalism and explore those philosophical ideas through dialogue and quests. But that's unfortunately not what happened here. The Outer Worlds is overtly political, but it doesn't manage to realize all the potential that would come from that. As I said in the very beginning of this video, I think the Outer Worlds is overall fine. I would still recommend playing it since I generally like the themes and the writing, but you shouldn't expect a masterpiece.